There is a desk in the Oval Office built from the oak timbers of a British Arctic exploration vessel. Queen Victoria sent it to the United States in 1880 as a diplomatic gift. The wood was cut from the hull of HMS Resolute, a ship that had been trapped in Arctic ice, abandoned, recovered, and returned to Britain by American whalers. The desk has survived renovations, fires, assassination aftermaths, and structural condemnations of the building around it. 45 men have governed from behind it, or its predecessors, in that same room holding identical constitutional powers. One of them is ranked by historians as the greatest president who ever lived. Another is ranked as the worst. They served back to back. Same building, same oath, same authority. The difference was the person sitting down. That difference is what every major presidential ranking tries to measure. The C-SPAN Presidential Historians Survey, most recently conducted in 2021, polled 142 historians and professional observers of the presidency who evaluated each president across 10 categories of leadership, including crisis management, moral authority, international relations, and administrative skill. The Siena College Research Institute runs a parallel survey with comparable methodology. The American Political Science Association conducts its own. The results are never identical, but the patterns are remarkably stable. The bottom stays the bottom. The top stays the top. The interesting part is the middle, because the middle shifts, sometimes by 10 or 15 positions in a single generation. And those shifts reveal what the country has learned, unlearned, or finally been forced to confront about its own history. This is every president, ranked from worst to best, and the evidence that separates them. Start at the bottom. James Buchanan served from 1857 to 1861, and he is ranked last or second to last in virtually every major survey ever conducted. What makes Buchanan's failure extraordinary is not the scale of the disaster he oversaw. It is his resume. Before the presidency, he had served as a United States congressman, a senator, the minister to Russia, the minister to Great Britain, and the Secretary of State. No president in American history entered the office with a more complete set of diplomatic and legislative credentials. He was also the only president who never married, a lifelong bachelor in an era that found that unusual but tolerated it. He had every qualification, and he did almost nothing as the country fractured. 7 states seceded from the Union before Abraham Lincoln's inauguration. Buchanan watched it happen from the White House. He believed secession was illegal, but he also believed the federal government had no constitutional authority to prevent it. So he sat. When Lincoln finally arrived, Buchanan reportedly told him, "If you are as happy entering the presidency as I am leaving it, then you are a very happy man." The exact phrasing varies across sources, but the relief was real. Buchanan returned to his estate, Wheatland, in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and spent his remaining 7 years defending his record in letters that almost no one read. Wheatland is now a museum. It is one of the only presidential homes in America whose central interpretive purpose is to explain what went wrong. Just above Buchanan sits Franklin Pierce. Pierce won the 1852 election comfortably, but before he ever reached Washington, tragedy destroyed whatever capacity he had to govern. In January 1853, 2 months before his inauguration, a train carrying Pierce and his family derailed near Andover, Massachusetts. Pierce and his wife Jane survived. Their 11-year-old son Benny was killed before their eyes, reportedly the only fatality in the accident. Jane Pierce spent much of the presidency in the upstairs rooms of the White House, writing letters to her dead child. Pierce entered office consumed by grief and alcohol. He signed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which reopened the question of slavery in the Western Territories and ignited the violence known as Bleeding Kansas, a direct precursor to the Civil War. His own party refused to renominate him in 1856. He remains one of only a handful of sitting presidents whose own party looked at them and decided anyone else would be better. Andrew Johnson occupies the bottom tier for different reasons. Johnson was the only Southern senator who remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War. That loyalty is why Lincoln chose him as a running mate in 1864, a deliberate unity ticket pairing a Republican president with a war Democrat from Tennessee. Johnson was barely literate. He had taught himself the rudiments of reading, and it was his wife, Eliza, who taught him to write and furthered his education. When Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865, Johnson inherited the presidency, the ruins of the Confederacy, and the question of what freedom would actually mean for 4 million formerly enslaved people. His answer was almost nothing. He vetoed civil rights legislation, opposed the 14th Amendment, and attempted to restore the Southern power structure as quickly as possible. The House of Representatives impeached him in 1868. The Senate vote to convict fell short by a single vote, 35-19, one short of the 2/3 majority required for removal. Andrew Johnson survived the presidency by the thinnest constitutional margin in American history. He was chosen to symbolize reconciliation. He became the single greatest obstacle to it. Warren Harding completes the worst tier. Harding was a newspaper publisher from Marion, Ohio, who won the 1920 election in a landslide. He was personally charming, broadly well-liked, and almost entirely uninterested in the mechanics of governing. He filled his administration with friends and allies from Ohio, a group later known as the Ohio Gang, and gave them extraordinary access to federal money, appointments, and resources. His Interior Secretary, Albert Fall, leased federal oil reserves at Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private oil companies in exchange for personal loans and gifts totaling roughly $400,000. Fall became the first cabinet member in United States history convicted of a felony committed while in office. Harding himself died in San Francisco in August 1923, officially of a heart attack or stroke, though persistent rumors allege poisoning by his wife Florence. No credible evidence supports the poisoning theory. The important fact is simpler. Harding was genuinely popular when he died. The scandals broke after his death. He never faced a single consequence. The public mourned a president whose administration was already rotting from inside. Below the worst tier, but still in the bottom third, sit presidents whose failures were quieter, but structurally instructive. John Tyler established the constitutional precedent that the vice president fully becomes president upon the death of the incumbent, not merely an acting placeholder. That precedent still governs the office today. Tyler was also expelled from his own party, the Whigs, while sitting in the White House, the only president in American history to be formally disowned by his political party during his term. After leaving office, Tyler served in the Provisional Confederate Congress and was then elected to the Confederate House of Representatives, but died in January 1862 before that body convened. He is the only former president to have committed what the federal government considered treason. Millard Fillmore signed the Compromise of 1850, which included the Fugitive Slave Act, a law that required citizens in free states to assist in the capture and return of people who had escaped slavery. After leaving the presidency, Fillmore ran again in 1856 on the Know Nothing Party ticket, an openly anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant organization whose formal name was the American Party. he won one state. Maryland. A former president of the United States lent his name and his credibility to organize bigotry, and the country gave him a single state for the trouble. The middle of the rankings is where American historical memory simply collapses. This is the zone, roughly positions 15 through 35, where most Americans cannot name the presidents, cannot place them in order, and cannot identify a single significant act of their administrations. The presidency can make a competent person invisible. Rutherford B. Hayes entered office after the most disputed election in American history. The 1876 contest between Hayes and Samuel Tilden required a special congressional commission to resolve, and the political bargain that installed Hayes effectively ended Reconstruction in the South. James Garfield served 4 months before being assassinated. Chester Arthur, Garfield's vice president, surprised nearly everyone by becoming a genuine advocate for civil service reform, the spoils system that had arguably contributed to Garfield's murder by a disappointed office seeker. Benjamin Harrison won the Electoral College in 1888, while losing the popular vote to Grover Cleveland, who had won the previous election and would win the next one. Cleveland is the only president to serve 2 non-consecutive terms and is counted once in every ranking. Martin Van Buren inherited Andrew Jackson's economic policies and was blamed for the Panic of 1837. William McKinley presided over the Spanish-American War before being assassinated in 1901. Zachary Taylor died in office in 1850. Traditionally attributed to acute gastroenteritis after eating cherries and iced milk at a 4th of July celebration, though a 1991 exhumation tested for arsenic poisoning and found none. The exact cause remains debated by some historians, but foul play has been effectively ruled out. Calvin Coolidge believed that the business of America is business and presided over the economic expansion of the 1920s with minimal government intervention. His philosophy was enormously popular at the time and almost certainly contributed to the conditions that produced the crash of 1929. Coolidge left office before the collapse. His successor did not. Herbert Hoover may be the most tragic figure in the middle tier. Before entering politics, Hoover organized one of the largest humanitarian relief efforts in history, coordinating food distribution for millions of starving people across Belgium and Europe during and after World War I. He was genuinely one of the most accomplished humanitarians of the 20th century. Then he became president in 1929. The Depression struck, and he could not translate his instincts for large-scale relief into effective federal policy. The man who fed Europe could not feed America. The cruelty of that irony has defined his ranking ever since. Among the most structurally fascinating middle-tier stories are the accidental presidents, men who held the office without ever being elected to it. Gerald Ford is the purest case. He was appointed vice president under the 25th Amendment after Spiro Agnew resigned amid a bribery scandal. When Nixon resigned in August 1974, Ford became president. He had won 0 elections for either office he held, the only person in American history to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either. His first major act was pardoning Nixon, which almost certainly cost him the 1976 election against Jimmy Carter. The pardon was, at the time, one of the most deeply unpopular decisions in modern presidential history. Historians now generally regard it as the right call, a painful decision that allowed the country to move forward rather than endure years of criminal proceedings against a former president. Ford's most hated act became his most respected legacy, but only after he was gone. What makes these rankings genuinely alive is that they move. No president's reputation has shifted more dramatically in recent decades than Ulysses S. Grant. For nearly a century, Grant's presidency was dismissed by historians as corrupt, incompetent, and passively destructive. His ranking sat in the bottom 10 for most of the 20th century. The reason was not poor scholarship. It was deliberately distorted scholarship. Lost cause historiography, the narrative framework constructed by former Confederates and their intellectual descendants, systematically buried Grant's record on civil rights and recast the entire Reconstruction era as a tragic mistake. It worked so well that even mainstream historians repeated the framework for generations. Then the evidence caught up. A broader reassessment of Reconstruction, accelerated by Ron Chernow's 2017 biography, revealed what had been suppressed. Grant had used federal power more aggressively to protect black voting rights and dismantle the Ku Klux Klan than any president between Lincoln and Lyndon Johnson. He has moved more than 10 positions upward in the rankings since 2000. The general who won the war was punished by history because the people who lost the war wrote the textbooks. Grant's personal story carries its own devastating trajectory. After commanding over 1 million soldiers, he left the presidency, entered private business, and lost his entire life savings in a Ponzi scheme run by Ferdinand Ward. Broke and diagnosed with terminal throat cancer, Grant spent his final months in a cottage at Mount McGregor, New York, writing his memoirs in a race against death. He finished the manuscript days before he died in July 1885. The book earned his family an estimated $450,000, well over $10 million in today's terms, and is still considered one of the finest military memoirs ever written. Mark Twain published it. Grant's tomb on Riverside Drive in New York City was reportedly once more visited than the Statue of Liberty. Today, most New Yorkers walk past it without stopping. Dwight Eisenhower has risen steadily in every survey since the 1980s. Once dismissed as a passive caretaker president who played too much golf, Eisenhower is now credited with managing the Cold War without a major ground conflict. Launching the interstate highway system, enforcing desegregation at Little Rock, and delivering one of the most striking farewell addresses in American history. In January 1961, a 5-star general, a man who had commanded the Allied invasion of Normandy, stood before the American public and warned them about the growing influence of the military-industrial complex. The man best equipped to understand military power told the nation to fear it. The contradiction anchors his rising reputation. The upper middle tier is where moral complexity becomes inescapable. Andrew Jackson expanded democratic participation for white men, destroyed the Second Bank of the United States, survived an assassination attempt, won the Battle of New Orleans, and dominated American politics for a generation. He also carried 2 bullets in his body from pre-presidential duels. His 1829 inaugural celebration at the White House spiraled into such chaos that, according to contemporary accounts, staff placed tubs of punch on the White House lawn to draw the crowd outside before they destroyed the furniture. Jackson is also the president who signed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which authorized the forced displacement of tens of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations were driven westward along routes that killed thousands. The Trail of Tears is not a metaphor. It is a body count attached to a presidential signature. Jackson remains the most polarizing figure in any ranking, a populist champion and an architect of ethnic cleansing. And historians cannot separate the two because Jackson himself never tried to. Thomas Jefferson authored the Declaration of Independence. He wrote that all men are created equal. He enslaved more than 600 people over the course of his lifetime. His estate, Monticello, is a masterwork of neoclassical architecture, designed by Jefferson, built by enslaved labor, maintained by enslaved hands. The contradiction is not abstract. It is architectural. It is embedded in the bricks. Monticello's interpretation has shifted dramatically in recent years. The site now prominently features the living quarters of enslaved workers and tells the story of Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman who bore several of Jefferson's children, a relationship confirmed by DNA evidence in 1998. The Louisiana Purchase doubled the geographic size of the nation. The man who defined American liberty could not reconcile it with his own household. Woodrow Wilson, meanwhile, envisioned the League of Nations, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and resegregated the federal civil service. He screened Birth of a Nation, a film celebrating the Ku Klux Klan, at the White House. His ranking has fallen in recent surveys as historians weigh racial consequences alongside diplomatic vision. The near Great Tier is where the rankings become most surprising, because it is populated by presidents the public underestimated or rejected at the time. Harry Truman left office in January 1953 with a 32% approval rating, one of the lowest ever recorded for a departing president. He was a former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, with no college degree. He inherited the presidency when Franklin Roosevelt died in April 1945, and within 4 months faced the decision to use the atomic bomb against Japan. He authorized the Marshall Plan, which rebuilt Western Europe. He helped create NATO. He desegregated the United States military by executive order in 1948, a decision that required no congressional approval and was implemented over fierce resistance from senior military leadership. On election night that same year, the Chicago Daily Tribune printed its early edition with the headline, "Dewey defeats Truman." The photograph of Truman holding that newspaper, grinning with obvious delight, became the most famous image of his presidency and a permanent monument to the fallibility of conventional wisdom. Truman is now consistently ranked in the top 6 to 8. The haberdasher from Missouri, the man with no degree, outranks nearly every Ivy League president who ever sat in the Oval Office. Lyndon Baines Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and created Medicare and Medicaid. His Great Society legislative program was the most ambitious domestic agenda since FDR's New Deal. Johnson's method was personal, relentless, and sometimes brutal. White House telephone recordings, Johnson taped conversations obsessively, capture him calling individual senators, applying pressure that ranged from flattery to barely concealed threats, working vote by vote to pass civil rights legislation that his own Southern political base fiercely opposed. Those recordings are preserved at the LBJ Presidential Library. They document both his greatest achievement and his deepest flaw, because the same man who muscled civil rights through Congress also escalated the Vietnam War until it consumed his presidency, his party, and his health. By March 1968, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The most effective domestic legislator of the 20th century was destroyed by a foreign war he widened but could not win. The phone that recorded his triumphs also recorded his catastrophe. Only 4 presidents consistently occupy the top tier, and each one fundamentally redefined what the office could be. Theodore Roosevelt became president at 42 after McKinley's assassination, the youngest president in history. He broke up monopolies, won the Nobel Peace Prize for mediating the end of the Russo-Japanese War, championed the construction of the Panama Canal, and placed roughly 230 million acres of American land under federal protection, national parks, forests, and monuments on a scale no president has matched. He invented the concept of the presidency as a bully pulpit, an active moral and political platform rather than a passive administrative role. In October 1912, running as a third-party candidate on the Progressive Bull Moose ticket, Roosevelt was shot in the chest while preparing to deliver a campaign speech in Milwaukee. The bullet passed through his steel eyeglass case and the folded 50-page manuscript of his speech, both in his breast pocket, which slowed the round enough to prevent fatal damage. Roosevelt examined the wound, noted he was not coughing blood, and delivered the speech anyway. He spoke for roughly 80 minutes with a bullet lodged between his ribs. The blood-stained manuscript still exists. The man who split his own party and handed the presidency to Woodrow Wilson was also the man who redefined what presidential energy looked like. Franklin Delano Roosevelt served 4,422 days in office, longer than any other president. He won 4 consecutive presidential elections. He created Social Security, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and a constellation of New Deal agencies that fundamentally restructured the relationship between the federal government and American citizens. He led the country through World War II. He held 998 press conferences during his presidency. And he did all of this from a wheelchair that the American public almost never saw. Roosevelt contracted polio at age 39 and lost the use of his legs. The press, by informal agreement, almost never photographed him in the wheelchair or being carried. Only 2 known photographs clearly show it. The same president who built the most transparent public relationship in the history of the office, fireside radio chats, constant press access, visible emotional warmth, was also concealing a fundamental physical reality from the country he governed. Roosevelt also signed Executive Order 9066 in February 1942, authorizing the forced internment of approximately 120,000 Japanese Americans, a moral catastrophe executed by a president ranked in the top 3. After his death in April 1945, Congress passed the 22nd Amendment, ratified in 1951, limiting future presidents to 2 terms. Roosevelt's tenure was so unprecedented that the Constitution itself had to be rewritten to prevent it from happening again. George Washington could have been king. That statement is not metaphorical. After the Revolution, with no constitutional precedent, no established norm for term limits, and a personal popularity that bordered on national worship, Washington could have held power indefinitely. No one would have stopped him. He served 2 terms and stepped down. The precedent held for 150 years until Roosevelt shattered it. Washington set virtually every foundational norm of the presidency, the cabinet system, the title Mr. President rather than the grander forms that were seriously proposed in Congress, the principle that the military answers to a civilian commander, and the peaceful transfer of power between administrations. His farewell address, published in September 1796, warned the country against the dangers of political factions and permanent foreign alliances. He enslaved people throughout his life and arranged in his will for their emancipation upon Martha's death. More than Jefferson ever did, and immeasurably less than the founding rhetoric demanded. The most powerful thing the first president ever did was prove that the office was temporary. Abraham Lincoln sits at the top. Every major historian survey places him first or second, and no serious ranking has ever dropped him below 3rd. The evidence supporting the position is almost absurd in its density and contradiction. Lincoln served a single term in the United States House of Representatives before winning the presidency. He lost more elections than he won before 1860. He was a self-taught lawyer from Illinois with no administrative experience, no military command, and no diplomatic background. He held the Union together through a civil war that killed more than 620,000 people. A figure that recent scholarship by historian J. David Hacker suggests may be closer to 750,000. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, which technically freed enslaved people only in Confederate-held territory, the very places where the Union had no enforcement power. The moral grandeur of the act was legally incomplete by design. It was a war measure, not a humanitarian decree. The 13th Amendment, which permanently abolished slavery throughout the United States, passed Congress in January 1865, less than 3 months before the war ended. Lincoln's cabinet was a calculated assembly of political rivals, men who had competed against him for the Republican nomination and believed themselves more qualified. William Seward, Salmon Chase, and Edward Bates all thought Lincoln was beneath the office. He used their ambition and managed their egos for 4 years. His Gettysburg Address was 272 words, delivered in roughly 2 minutes at the dedication of a military cemetery. It redefined the meaning of the war, the nation, and the founding principles in fewer words than most presidents used to open a routine policy address. Lincoln's personal life was shadowed by depression and loss. His son Willie died in the White House in 1862 at age 11. Lincoln was assassinated at Ford's Theater on April 14, 1865, 5 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. The rocking chair he sat in, the door John Wilkes Booth entered through, the 12-foot drop to the stage, all of it is preserved. Ford's Theater remains a functioning performance venue that is simultaneously a crime scene. Lincoln's funeral procession traveled 1,654 miles by rail through 180 cities. The country watched a coffin cross the nation on train tracks. No other presidential death has produced anything remotely comparable. The man who entered the presidency with the least political experience is ranked as the greatest who ever served. The man who entered with the most, James Buchanan, his immediate predecessor in the same office, is ranked as the worst. They took the same oath in the same building, separated by a single inauguration day. The rankings themselves are not static. They are a living, shifting argument conducted by scholars who disagree about methodology, weigh different criteria, and revisit the same evidence with evolving questions. Grant has climbed more than 10 positions since 2000 as lost cause historiography has been dismantled. Wilson has fallen as his racial record receives greater scrutiny. Eisenhower has risen steadily as the Cold War era is reassessed with less partisan heat. Jimmy Carter left the White House in 1981, widely considered a failed president, weak on the economy, humiliated by the Iran hostage crisis, defeated by Ronald Reagan in a landslide. His post-presidency changed everything. The Nobel Peace Prize in 2002, decades with Habitat for Humanity, election monitoring, disease eradication work. Carter's life after the office is now rated by many scholars as the greatest post-presidential career in American history. The presidency broke his reputation. The decades after rebuilt it on completely different foundations. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. Adams's last words were reportedly, "Thomas Jefferson survives." Jefferson had died several hours earlier. The exact phrasing varies across accounts, but the coincidence does not. Two founders, two presidents, two rivals who had become friends again in old age, dying on the same day, on the anniversary of the document that started the entire experiment. What the rankings consistently reveal is that the qualities Americans most associate with presidential potential, military service, political experience, party loyalty, intellectual credentials, personal charisma, do not reliably predict success in the office. Buchanan possessed all of them. Lincoln possessed almost none. The presidency is a constitutional amplifier. It does not generate wisdom, courage, or moral clarity. It magnifies whatever the person already carries. The same room, the same powers, the same oath produce both the preservation of the Union and the passive observation of its disintegration. The resolute desk still sits in the Oval Office. Queen Victoria's gift, built from the timbers of an abandoned ship recovered from Arctic ice, has been used by Kennedy, Reagan, Obama, Biden, and others. It has also been used by presidents ranked in the bottom third. The wood does not distinguish between them. The Constitution does not adjust its authority to match the character of the person who holds it. The office is identical. The crisis varies. The person varies. Everything else follows from that. 45 portraits hang in the same White House corridor, worst and best sharing the same wall, the same light, the same frame dimensions, the same silence. The building has carried all of them. The desk remains.